Hey people, it's ScionVise and welcome back to the second installment of Breaking the Backlog for February 2021. In this series, I spend all of my free time going through a bunch of games that I've wanted to play but ended up ignoring or forgetting about for whatever reason. I started off strong in January with a lot of games that I really ended up liking. I managed to play a lot this month too, so let's see what I got done in February. The first game I beat in February was Aviary Attorney. It's essentially a Phoenix Wright game, except with actual birds. The main thing that attracted me to it was its art style, essentially parodying the line art caricatures of J.J. Granville, which really sets it apart from a lot of other modern games. It plays exactly like you'd expect from other lawyer games, getting evidence, talking to witnesses, and defending your client in court by picking apart statements and presenting evidence. The cast of characters is colorful and fun, and while the entire game takes place in Paris, the number of areas you can visit is pretty high for a game like this. The soundtrack is pretty good too, considering it's all classical music, taking from Samson and Delilah among other musical works. Some of it is a little anachronistic since the game takes place in 1848 and some of the soundtrack was composed after that, but I don't even know why I'm bringing that up since it's a game where you're a bird lawyer solving animal murder. Anyways, I definitely had a good time. I'd recommend using a guide for the third act though, as it branches and it's pretty hard to know what you need to do and exactly when you need to do it. Still a fun game, and if you'd like to know what would happen if you mixed the French February Revolution with Ace Attorney, but Phoenix is an actual bird, then this is definitely a game you'll want to check out. Then I finished up the Alan Wake story with Alan Wake's American Nightmare. So where the main game is kinda based on horror novels, American Nightmare is based on The Twilight Zone, and it acts like a nice epilogue for the main game. There's a whole new narrator who calls Alan the Champion of Light. It's really cheesy, but I like it. That being said, explaining any of the story would be big spoilers for Alan Wake, so I'll be skipping that. This game takes place in 3 open areas that you visit multiple times due to a time loop. It's a really cool idea, but the game doesn't really do a lot with it. You don't go exploring entirely new parts of the world each time, you just end up doing the same things over and over again, but with fewer steps each time. There are quite a few things I really like though. Alan having an actual visible health bar is nice, rather than the vague screen sepia that games like to do at the time. There are a lot of new enemies and weapons, and the game doesn't reset you to 0 in between each chapter, so that's all nice, but because the areas feel empty and get used less and less over time, it kinda just feels like a waste of a good idea. I did enjoy my time with it, but unless you really want to see what happens after Alan Wake, it's hardly required reading. Next up is Control. I've been waiting for this game to be put on Xbox Game Pass, so when it finally did, I jumped on it ASAP. And while I did like it, I'm glad I waited. The game is fun, don't get me wrong, and I love the world that it creates. These sorts of worlds that are full of unique, horrifying entities are great, like the early 2010s SCP stuff. The combat is pretty fun as well, with Remedy basically evolving a lot of what was done in Alan Wake. A small amount of very different weapons with a few unique abilities that really change things up. I liked exploring the Bureau, it's well designed and easy enough to remember where things are, and there are quite a few secrets with some higher level key cards that you get throughout the game. That being said, I definitely wish it took some of its ideas and ran with them more. The motel sections are really interesting, and they definitely could have made some really interesting puzzles using the concept of like the rule of threes sort of thing, but it's always kind of just glossed over, just a transition area between other parts of the game. Overall, I had fun with it, but it never gripped me as much as I thought it could have if it explored its best ideas more or better. I never thought, wow, this sucks, but I also never thought, wow, this is amazing. Aside from just not doing enough with these ideas, there are a few actual complaints. RNG mods for weapons and abilities really rubbed me the wrong way. I don't think this has any place in a single player game like this. And Jesse's internal monologue quickly went from being endearing to being annoying, like within an hour. Still, I do love that Remedy is attempting to expand on this world, and I would love to see more games that take place in it in the future. Okay, so this is a little embarrassing. I'm a huge fan of the Zelda series and have played most of them, but until now, I've never actually beaten A Link to the Past. I don't know exactly why either, but most times I've tried to beat it, I basically just get to the Skull Woods and drop the game after that. But I was determined to get through it this time, and I did. And I liked it. I definitely wouldn't call it my favorite Zelda game, not even my favorite top-down Zelda game, that goes to Link's Awakening, but for 1991, and essentially the first of its kind, it's massively impressive. The world design is incredible, there's a reason so many games in the future basically took what this game did and ran with it. I love exploring for secrets and different upgrades, which is something that the Zelda games do really well, pretty much exclusively thanks to this game. There are some things I didn't like though. For instance, I don't think the combat is any good, some of the bosses are no fun, and some of the Dark World dungeons are more than a little annoying, but basically everything else is fantastic. The biggest disappointment was just me waiting so long to actually finish it. Next up was Abzu. Anyone who's played anything by that game company probably knows what to expect from Abzu. It's effectively Flower, but with fish. I do really like these more artistic experiences, but I don't think Abzu does enough to really stand out from the pack. It's good, it looks fantastic, it controls well enough for being a permanent water level, and the score, written by Austin Wintory, is obviously incredible, but it kind of feels like just another one of these sorts of games. It even has the same general themes of nature reclaiming the earth that Flower has, but expresses it in a less evocative way in my opinion. It's got some secrets to find, so it's not a fully guided tour sort of game, which is definitely a plus, and it's worth playing for people who like these experiences, but again, it doesn't really do a lot to stand out. I never grew up with a PlayStation, so I completely missed out of pretty much anything from that side of the aisle as a kid. Even after I started getting these consoles, I never really went back to any of the old classics from the original system. So when the Spyro trilogy got a remaster, I knew that this would be the time to get into it. Then I bought it, and I just didn't play it. So, starting with Spyro 1, I had a really good time. It's a good 90s platformer through and through. Spyro controls well, the levels are pretty much all fun to explore, and while there really isn't a whole lot of unique stuff to do in any of them aside from beat enemies, find dragons, and collect gems, it was still a good time. And of course, Stuart Copeland's soundtrack is incredible and fits the game super well. The remastered music is good too, but I typically kept the original music on. My main criticism is on the gliding. It is a bit wonkier than I would have liked, especially with the game being remade from the ground up like this. The PC port is not as good as I'd have liked as well. It has a lot of weird issues where Spyro would slide along the ground even when not being controlled, and some stage gimmicks just simply wouldn't work, causing a soft lock until I manually changed the game's frame rate. There were some other glitches as well, but the frame rate issues were by far the worst of them. But overall, it's a nice simple platformer that I not only had a lot of fun playing, but I actually got the full 120% in it, so yeah, I really liked it, and I can't wait to play Spyro 2. Next was Crash Bandicoot 2. Like I said, I never grew up with a PlayStation, so I missed out on these games when I grew up, so I have no nostalgia goggles to view them through. With that in mind, I don't understand this series. I managed to beat Crash 2, and even do some of the extra stuff like getting some platinum relics and extra gems and the like, but I just don't get it. I hate how this game plays, and this is supposed to be one of the best Crash games. The jumping just feels awful. Way too heavy, but also super loose. The enemies and level design aren't very impressive, and what even are these ice physics? I've never experienced worse in any game. That being said, there was some good stuff here, and it kept my attention long enough to motivate me through to the end, but I cannot see myself attempting Crash 3 or 4 when it releases on PC. The game does look really nice, and the soundtrack is really good too, so as a remake of the original games, it more than excels, but I don't know, I guess this style of gameplay just isn't for me. Lastly in February was Shadow Complex Remastered. This was originally an old Xbox Live Arcade game that I never had the chance to play because I never owned an Xbox 360. So when it got remastered in 2016, I bought it and never played it. I'm really upset that I didn't do this too, because it's right up my alley. It's like literally Metroid. The world is set up like Super Metroids with a big interconnected world filled to the brim with goodies to find and places to explore. The upgrades you'll find work just like Metroid, with suits to decrease damage, health upgrades, missiles, bombs, a grappling hook, etc. It even does something that the Metroid series would go on to do 8 years later, having full 360-degree aiming for the shooting. In regards to the shooting, it's not always amazing. It has a 2.5D sort of thing going on where you can aim around in 360 degrees, but if an enemy is in the background or foreground and you aim adjacent to them, the gun will automatically attempt to aim at them. It doesn't work nearly as well as I think the team wanted, and this made fighting some enemies and particularly some bosses a lot more frustrating than it should have been. That being said, I had a blast playing through it and I can't wait to go back in the future for more runs. And I do have a couple of retirees this time around. First up is We Happy Few. I was really excited for this game when it was announced. I mean, come on, it was going to be a game like Deus Ex, but with a focus on blending in socially rather than kneeling behind boxes. Cool. But as it progressed more and more into a run-of-the-mill survival game with a few neat aspects, I got less and less interested. I did still want to try it out, so I did, and yeah, it's just a survival game with a few neat aspects. I simply don't like these sorts of games. It's such a shame that such a fantastic concept became so uninteresting with its gameplay. And finally, we have Crash Bandicoot 1. It wasn't a coincidence that I beat Crash 2 this month. I first attempted to play the original, but I hate this game. All my criticisms of 2 are here, but are way worse in every way. It feels awful to play, the level design is bad, the hitboxes are absolutely atrocious, and really, I just don't think this is a good game. Even considering it's from 1996. Mario 64 still plays fantastically, being from the same year, so I can only give it so much slack for being an early 3D platformer. I've said this about other games before. If you love it, good for you, I'm glad you like it, but I just can't see it all. Sorry. So that was Breaking the Backlog for February 2021. This month had some really high highs and some really low lows, which I did expect considering how wide a gamut the games I played this month covered. You may have noticed that most of the games I played over the last few months were fairly short. I did that on purpose. If I had to dedicate myself to a massive JRPG or something for this list, I'd only have like 1 or 2 games a month to actually list. I have started one bigger game that I'm hoping to have done in March, but I guess I'll have to see. Like I promised, here's a list of my top 10 so far this year on top of the list of the games from February on their own. So if a game that you really love isn't on the list here, I'm sorry, but no game can appeal to everyone, and only 10 can make this list. So anyways, thank you all so much for watching. I'll be back next month for Breaking the Backlog in March. See you all later.